For 50 consecutive years, from October 2nd, 1950 to February 13th, 2000, Charles Schulz never missed a single day drawing peanuts.
How long does it usually take you to draw a strip?
I can draw one of these daily episodes in an hour, and a Sunday page usually takes...
It was a feat of creative endurance unparalleled in the history of art. Day after day, week after week, for half a century, he sat down at his drawing board and brought Charlie Brown, Snoopy, and the whole gang to life. He built a global empire that, at its peak, reached 355 million readers in 2,600 newspapers across 75 countries. The characters he created weren't just ink on paper, they were cultural icons, generating over $1 billion a year in revenue from merchandise, television specials, and endorsements. Schultz became the most influential and successful cartoonist of all time, and he did it all on his own. Then, in the winter of 1999, it all stopped. With almost no warning, Schultz announced he was laying down his pen. The daily ritual for millions around the globe, the simple, profound comfort of a 4-panel gag strip, was ending forever. The news left fans confused, saddened, and searching for answers. The official explanation was retirement, a well-deserved rest after 5 decades of relentless deadlines. But that straightforward announcement didn't tell the full story. The truth was far more devastating. The man who brought so much joy to the world was hiding a secret crisis, a battle he was fighting while drawing his final, heartbreaking goodbyes. Now, the full, tragic story of why Peanuts ended so suddenly can find. To understand the shock of the end, you have to understand the man. Charles M. Schulz, known to his friends and family as Sparky, was inseparable from his creation. Unlike almost every other long-running comic creator, who eventually hired teams of writers and artists to handle the heavy lifting, Schultz was fiercely, almost obsessively, protective of Peanuts. He wrote, drew, inked, and lettered every single one of the 17,897 strips himself. This intense level of control didn't come from ego. It was rooted in a lifetime of insecurity, loneliness, and a deep-seated belief that the strip was the only place he could truly be himself. Long before Peanuts became a global phenomenon, Charles was an emotionally neglected and quiet kid growing up in St. Paul, Minnesota. He was the only child of a German father who worked as a barber and a Norwegian mother. Shy and made more so by skipping 2 grades in school, he often felt isolated and unseen. Drawing became his refuge, his escape from a reality where he rarely felt confident. That feeling of rejection was seared into his memory when, as a senior in high school, his drawings were rejected by the yearbook staff, a small slight that stuck with him for the rest of his life. Instead of walking away, he retreated further into his work, honing his craft through a correspondence cartoon course his mother had encouraged him to take. Then, in 1943, his life was shattered by a 1-2 punch of grief and duty. In February, his mother Dina died of cervical cancer. Just days later, the 20-year-old Schultz was drafted into the U.S. Army and shipped off to basic training. He never got a proper goodbye, a wound that never fully healed. He would later say, "The Army taught me all I needed to know about loneliness." Serving as a machine gun squad leader in the 20th Armored Division in Europe, he was confronted with the grim realities of war, an experience that deepened his already melancholic worldview. When he returned home, drawing was more than a hobby. It was his identity. It was the only way he could process the loss and isolation that had come to define him. This philosophy was so fundamental to his being that he would later make a decision few artists with $1 billion empire would ever consider, a decision that would seal the fate of Peanuts from the very beginning. It all began with just one clause. As the Peanuts franchise grew from a simple comic strip into a massive commercial enterprise, Charles Schulz made a deliberate and final decision about its fate. He put it in writing, right there in his contract with the syndicate, the moment he was unable to continue, whether through retirement or death. the strip would end. No one else would ever be allowed to draw Charlie Brown and his friends. Financially, this was an almost unthinkable move. Franchises like this were designed to outlive their creators, passed down to teams of artists to generate revenue for decades. But for Schultz, it was never about the money. Creatively, he refused to compromise. He believed the integrity and honesty of the work mattered more than anything. To him, allowing someone else to draw the strip would turn it into a cheap imitation, stripping peanuts of its soul. He famously said that he was the strip, and the strip was him. There was no separation. But even as his empire grew, a quiet, unseen battle was beginning. Sometime in the 1980s, loyal readers began to notice a subtle change in his art. A slight wobble, an almost imperceptible tremor, had appeared in the clean, steady lines that had defined his work for decades. The reality was frightening. Schultz began complaining to friends, "Sometimes my hand shakes so much I have to hold my wrist to draw." The diagnosis was essential tremor, a neurological disorder causing involuntary shaking. For a man whose entire life and identity depended on the steadiness of his hand, it was a terrifying development. He adapted, incorporating the tremor into his style as a quiet act of defiance against his own body. By the late 1990s, Charles Schulz's unwavering discipline was met with a force it couldn't control. His health began to seriously unravel. The boundless energy that had propelled him for 5 decades was suddenly gone. Then, in November of 1999, the situation escalated into a full-blown medical catastrophe. It started with excruciating abdominal cramps. He was rushed to the hospital, where doctors discovered a blocked abdominal aorta, a critical emergency that was cutting off blood flow to his lower body. During the emergency surgery to repair it, another disaster struck. Doctors discovered he had colon cancer, and it had already metastasized, spreading to his stomach. And as if that wasn't enough, he also suffered a series of small strokes during the procedure. When Schultz awoke, his world was irrevocably altered. The strokes had damaged his vision, leaving him partially blind in one eye. He couldn't see clearly. He struggled to read. And most devastatingly, he could not draw. The man who lived through his pen had his primary tool stolen from him by a cascade of medical failures. His son, Monty, said his father fell into a profound depression. The indomitable will to fight, which had seen him through a quadruple heart bypass surgery in 1981, began to fade. Chemotherapy only made things worse, further blurring his vision and deepening his exhaustion. For months, he and his family grappled with this brutal reality in private. The world knew nothing. Schultz, ever the professional, had banked several weeks of strips in advance, so the daily paper continued to run new Peanuts comics as always. But his career was over. Only he and his family knew the secret he was hiding. On December 14, 1999, Charles Schulz made the announcement he had spent a lifetime avoiding. He was retiring. The news sent a shockwave across the globe. Fans and fellow cartoonists expressed a deep sense of loss. Readers openly admitted they cried. Many described it as losing a family member. The official statement released to the public was a gentle, dignified version of the brutal truth, stating he wanted to focus on my health and my family without the worry of a daily deadline. But in a television interview with Al Roker, a frail and emotional Schultz struggled to find the words to describe his situation. "I never dreamed that this was what would happen to me," he confessed, fighting back tears. "All of a sudden it's gone. It's been taken away from me. I did not take this away from me." That sense of injustice, of having his life's work stolen from him by forces beyond his control, was palpable. For a man defined by discipline and control, who in nearly 50 years had only taken one 5-week vacation, this was the ultimate cruelty. As he drew and signed his final strip, a wave of realization washed over him. He later recounted the moment, his voice thick with emotion. "All of a sudden I thought, you know that poor kid? He never even got to kick the football. What a dirty trick. He never had a chance to kick the football. In that moment, the line between creator and creation blurred completely. Charlie Brown's perpetual disappointment had become his own. The final daily strip ran on January 3, 2000, featuring Snoopy at his typewriter with a heartfelt farewell letter from Schultz. But he had prepared one last full-color goodbye for the Sunday paper. The world waited for that final strip, completely unaware it would coincide with a final, poetic tragedy. The very last original Peanuts strip was scheduled to be published on Sunday, February 13, 2000. Drawn weeks in advance, it was a poignant collage of memories. It featured Snoopy, perched atop his doghouse at his typewriter, composing Schultz's final letter to his readers, surrounded by ethereal images of the gang. The letter ended with the words, "Charlie Brown, Snoopy, Linus, Lucy, how can I ever forget them?" But the universe had one last, cruelly poetic chapter to write. On the night of Saturday, February 12, 2000, just hours before that final strip would appear in newspapers, Charles Schulz passed away peacefully in his sleep from complications of colon cancer. He was 77. The next morning, millions of people unfolded their Sunday papers, completely unaware that the artist had died just hours before. They read his goodbye, a letter from a man they believed was just beginning his retirement, but who was, in fact, already gone. The timing was so improbable, so perfectly and tragically aligned, that it felt like a final panel drawn by fate itself. As his biographer David Michaelis wrote, "In the moment of ceasing to be a cartoonist, he ceased to be." The story of Peanuts and the story of Charles Schulz had begun together, and in the end, they concluded on the very same day. It was only after his death that many fans began to truly understand the man behind the strips, because behind the gentle humor and the round-headed kids was a life carved out by intense and often sad emotions. Despite being one of the most famous people on the planet, Schultz moved through life with a persistent feeling of being unseen and unloved, battling what many now recognize as clinical depression. He carried his pain quietly, holding on to every slight and emotional wound, from the yearbook rejection to deeper losses. That darkness began early. As a child, he developed a lifelong fear of abandonment that bled directly into the world of Peanuts. Love in the strip is rarely returned. Charlie Brown pines for the little red-haired girl who never notices him, a direct reflection of Schultz's own unrequited love for a red-haired woman named Donna Johnson, who turned down his marriage proposal shortly before Peanuts began. Characters constantly reach out for connection, only to be met with indifference or outright rejection. The characters themselves feel less like inventions and more like fragments of his own inner life. Charlie Brown's constant self-doubt, anxiety, and feelings of inadequacy were Schultz's own. Lucy's bossiness and impatience reflected his intolerance for weakness. Linus's need for a security blanket represented a universal need for comfort in an anxious world. And Snoopy's rich fantasy life, as the World War I flying ace, the famous novelist, the cool college student Joe Cool, feels like a necessary escape from a reality that was often too heavy to bear. Strip by strip, for 50 years, Schultz laid himself bare, disguising his deepest confessions as comedy. In the end, the gentle melancholy that permeated his work was a reflection of a life that understood disappointment intimately. Charlie Brown, the boy who never gets to kick the football, became the perfect metaphor for Schultz's own final unfulfilled wish, to leave his life's work on his own terms. Yet, the legacy of Peanuts is one of profound connection. In the simple lines of a boy and his dog, we see our own hopes, our own anxieties, and our own good grief moments. Charles Schulz may have felt he lost his final battle, but through his art, his honest and unflinching voice remains a constant in our lives, a truth that will never end.